Well, good morning, everybody, East Coast to West Coast, and I'm hoping we've got some global people who couldn't sleep and are just pounding the caffeinated beverages. My name is Chris Mirzwa. I'm the CTO at Serious Computer Solutions, a CDW company, and I'm honored to be the MC for the third annual UniCon. This is fantastic. We have a huge day. I've looked at the agenda many times. I'm going to roughly say there's somewhere between 40 and 64 hours of content. Okay. So this thing goes through the entire weekend. I like to think of it as your own Lord of the Rings. Frodo's going to make the entire climb. So if you don't have like a sleeping bag and some chamomile tea, I'd get it now because this thing's going long. Okay. But now we're going to have a great day. Got a huge set of speakers. And we'll talk about more logistics as we go through. Let me knock out a couple straight up front. You can see on the slide that's up on the screen, we've got a Discord server set up. When you go there, you're going to see UniCon 2022. Feel free to head there. We got a lobby channel. You can chat it up. We've also got a Q&A channel, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the day. We'll also be monitoring the Q&A on Zoom as well. So whatever way you feel comfortable of putting in your questions, please feel free to put them in there. Any questions we don't get to during the day, don't worry. We're going to capture everything and then make sure that everybody gets an email with all of the answers to all of your Qs. Okay. So with that, without further ado, two people that probably don't need a big introduction. Like, you don't need to introduce us. Everybody knows us. I'm like, well, I know they do. But, and especially because Bryson today's in full purple head unicorn gear. I don't have my hoodie. I don't even know what you have the AC set to in there, Bryson, because I'm in LA today. It's 95. If I was wearing that, I'd probably drop 30 to 40 pounds. Easy.
Chris, you need to suffer for your craft.
God, you're not kidding. I mean, that is incredible. So, Bryson, the founder and CTO or CEO of Scythe, thank you for putting this together. Third annual, that's a huge accomplishment. We got a lot of people on. And George Orchias, the CTO at Scythe, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick things off this morning. Have a great show, and we'll talk to you here all in a bit.
Awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third annual UniCon conference. You may not know, but there's actually an official National Unicorn Day, and that's actually tomorrow. But since this is a work-related conference, we moved it to Friday. That way you can enjoy your weekend watching the repetition of this and the recording. Of course, everything's going to be recorded, and we will provide slides and all that good stuff. And just very, very excited to be here. And happy to have Bryson on. Bryson, people say that they've never actually seen you not wearing a unicorn outfit. I told them you actually wear that all the time to board meetings, to everything, but no.
No, not actually. It really only comes out for special occasions. I do have my entire costume wardrobe here next to me. So for those of you who ever ask about when is Sire Gandalf coming back, the robe is right there. The staff is right over there. All 5 of my custom unicorn hoodies in black and white for black hat and white hat, and then red team, blue team, and of course for this conference I break out the purple team costume. It's funny when I'm in business meetings though, and I'll be doing demos, and the other side will be like, "Hey man, why aren't you wearing the unicorn?" So like, as Chris pointed out, this isn't something that I can get away with wearing all the time. It gets a little warm.
Just a little. Awesome. Well, I'm very excited about today. Thank you, Chris, for emceeing. You'll see us jumping in and out throughout. And we have an amazing keynote today. Our theme is collaboration. And, we love to collaborate. We love purple teaming, which is essentially collaborating between all of your information security teams and even outside, giving back to the community, which we all love to do as well, especially here at Scythe. And I know a lot of you like doing that as well. So we're here giving back to the community and just really excited. Do you
Well, I
want
think
to?
you have collaboration actually in your Twitter feed because Red Canary, which Katie Nichols is at, just published their annual threat detection report, which we all love because it's seeing the real data that's out there so that you can make data-driven decisions for your security. So it's not all just black magic of whatever's happening. And George, you just published a community threat where you went through the detection guide and said, all right, well, what are all the top techniques that we've seen? And let's turn that into an actionable attack chain that we can test with.
Yep. And that's big thanks to Red Canary and actually providing actionable intelligence, which I'm sure Katie is going to talk about, and really going deep into actual procedures, right? Because MITRE attack technique is a technique ID. It has multiple ways of being done. So while it does give us a common language, we do want to get deeper into those procedures. And yeah, I think as an industry, we're getting better, thanks to folks like Red Canary that's doing it. The DFIR report is another awesome one. I know Katie's going to talk a little bit about that. So yeah, collaboration, working together, and it just improving, right? We're all in this together.
What's something in your wish list, George, that you wish the industry would be able to tackle in the next year to continue to improve collaboration?
Wow, way to put me in the spot.
Why, you're the CTO. That was a management decision.
We're going to put you in the hot seat and ask very difficult questions here, right, to start this off.
Well, at least we're not live. Nobody's recording this. It's just you and me.
So what is the one thing? Oh, look at that. We got the sharing going. What is the one thing as an industry I would like to see? I think everyone's seeing each other as other humans and being nice to each other and understanding where they're coming from is kind of the basis of actually working together outside of anything technical. I think there's a lot of drama, a lot of just people not being very nice to each other. I try very hard to stay away from that. And I think if we all are just kinder humans, right? We've all been through so much the last 2 years and kind of see things from other people's point of view. And tying this back to purple teaming, way back when in like 2015, started a red team at a large financial. And I was one of these people that made this mistake. Like, we were the red team that was awesome. We're better than everyone else. Our egos were here. We were getting through, doing a bunch of really cool stuff. And we weren't communicating it that cool. It was like just proving that we were better than everyone else. And it was not improving anything. It was making other people feel really bad about themselves, making them feel like what they did didn't mean anything, that, you know, with an adversary coming in, they're just going to get in. What's the point of this? And it wasn't until we actually all came together physically. Our CISO, Charles Blonner, shout out to him, best CISO ever, actually took us to Black Hat, and we all met each other as humans and realized that we are all humans. We all have challenges. Everyone is good at different things. And that's really something I've been pushing for a lot, even in the red team training of, you know, drop the ego. Everyone's good at different things. Let's work together. I think that would be fundamentally what I would love to see this year, is just being kind and seeing things from the other person's point of view so that you can, you know, break those silos, work together, and collaborate.
So I'll just add into that, make sure that you are including users in your risk assessment. They are the largest risk surface area you have in your enterprise. And of course, that empathy should extend to the fact that users are just trying to use computers to get their jobs done. And security cannot be the art of the no. So as I hand it over to Katie, I have to return the favor from 2 years ago. And I have to ask you, per our contractual guidelines, that you cannot spit La Croix all over your keyboard.
I think I can agree to that. I'm going to have to consult my lawyers, but I think I should be all right.
The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bryce and George, for hitting key points of my keynote. So like, I'm good. I'll just sign out now. Seriously though, great note to start off on. Such a pleasure to be here for UniCon 2022. Today I learned there's a National Unicorn Day, so that's pretty cool. So let's dive right in with that introduction, that kickoff to the day. We're going to talk a little bit about collaboration and also threat intelligence. That's where I come from. And of course, purple teaming. That's kind of why we are here. Got to start with introductions, right? When we're talking about empathy, always important to know where people are coming from, what their background is, what they have to bring to the table, because we all have something in this community. I describe what I do in cyber threat intel as helping inform decisions, right? Bringing context about threats, adversaries, malware, help someone make a decision. We'll talk more about that. My current role is as Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. If you're not familiar, we're a managed detection response company. So that's kind of where we get our visibility from real detections. And we also are passionate about sharing with the community. I'll talk about one of our awesome open source projects led by the incomparable Adam Mushinchi, is also listening today, Atomic Red Team. So Red Canary is a lot of my job. I also have the pleasure of teaching for SANS. I teach a cyber threat intelligence course. I'm teaching next week in Orlando. So there's a sweet pool at the hotel. Pumped about that. I love teaching. I love sharing knowledge. I know many people today do as well. Also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Whole new world for me of policy and trying to inform policymakers about this cybersecurity world, the practitioner world. And also important for discussion today, I'm an alumna of the MITRE ATT&CK team, the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations team. My former teammate, Jamie Williams, is going to be talking later about data sources, and such an honor to have that background. So again, this is me. I don't always do cyber though. When I don't do cyber, I like to feed squirrels bird seed instead of birds. I like to choose home decor stuff. I like to dabble in CrossFit. I like to bake things. So I don't always do cyber. Got to have that balance in life. Kicking off here, collaboration. Awesome. We should collaborate. Why? Well, collaboration feels great, right? When you think about collaboration, often it's a positive, like go team, awesome. And yeah, absolutely. At the end of a big collaboration, a big project, I feel awesome. And I hope you do as well, right? Teamwork makes the dream work. This is what we really think of ideally when we think of collaboration, but not to be too negative. Sometimes collaboration is pulling your hair out, right? We have this beautiful image of a kumbaya all working together, but if you've ever tried to collaborate, especially with someone who has a really different background or an opposite perspective to you, it can be a little bit frustrating. And we're going to kind of pull on that thread a little bit throughout this talk and talk about, hey, collaboration, sometimes it's tough. A key part of collaboration is compromise. And good compromise leaves everyone a little bit angry. But right, in the end, collaboration's worth it. Why bother? This is an old proverb that one of my mentors had on her wall, and I really love it. Right? Reflecting the fact that sure, if I want to get some red teaming, some purple teaming done quickly, and I can feel awesome about it, great. I will go ahead and do that myself. But right, if I want something that's useful, relevant, long lasting, if I want to go far, I need some help from my friends. I need to collaborate. So something to keep in mind, right? As you go about your work, I know it's tempting sometimes. I want to go fast. I'm also a very impatient person. I want to go fast too, but you're going to go farther going together and collaborating. Purple teaming, it's a natural collaboration, right? Bryson's got his purple hoodie on today. Red team plus blue team equals purple team. Awesome, red and blue BFFs. As George said, right? Red team, not just going out and doing their own thing. They're going to try to make defense better. That's what we all do. They're BFFs, and that's all well and good. But, right, my field is cyber threat intelligence. And sometimes when red teams and blue teams are BFFs, I feel a little bit like Milhouse sitting on a seesaw himself, right? Like, I want to be invited to the party. I want to play too. And the great news is, well, CTI, cyber threat intelligence, can absolutely come to the purple teaming party if we're invited, if you choose to collaborate with us. Let's back up, right? I hope we have people of lots of different backgrounds. Maybe you've never heard of cyber threat intel. Maybe you're coming to this conference to find out what purple teaming is. Awesome. Welcome. right? Here's how I think about cyber threat intelligence. And I think George hit it in the intro, right? Intelligence should be actionable. I define cyber threat intelligence as analyzed information about cyber threats that inform some kind of security decision. That's all it is, right? It seems like a really simple definition for something that maybe you've heard a lot about, right? Some people think of cyber threat intel as feeds of hash values and IPs, which sure, that can be a useful source for cyber threat intel, or people will think of attribution to China, Russia. That's the cool stuff, right? Well, that can certainly be part of cyber threat intel, but that's not all of it. Anytime you're analyzing information about cyber threats to inform a decision, that's cyber threat intel. And really important point about cyber threat intel, right? You might have seen these pew pew maps. There's an infamous company named Norse showing IP to IP connection. Pew pew maps, that is never cyber threat intel. Please get those out of your SOC walls regardless. Done. Why should cyber threat intel be invited to the party? Why can we all be BFFs, not just red and blue? Cyber threat intel can help make purple teaming realistic as well as relevant, right? If you start by thinking about the threats that are likely to affect your organization and build your purple teaming on that solid foundation, you can make sure you're checking your security against threats that are relevant, that matter, that might have, a significant impact. The other reason why I'm such a huge fan of inviting threat intel to the party is the reality is if you do testing and maybe you don't think about behaving like real threats that are relevant to you, you might think you're all set, right? You do your testing, do your purple teaming, and you're like, awesome, we are good to go. Then you get completely owned by an adversary. You're like, but I thought we were good to go, right? Testing without thinking about threats that are relevant might give you a false sense of security. So that's one of the reasons I think cyber threat intel is so valuable to adding in to this purple team party. A note, right? I know we have people from many different organizations here, and some of you might be thinking, well, I don't have a cyber threat intel team. Can I still get the benefits? Absolutely, right? Even if you don't have a dedicated team for this, some of the best cyber threat intel analysts I've worked with are SOC analysts who are just curious, who dive into threats, or red teamers who want to know more, who want to learn about how real threats operate. So what we're going to talk about today, all these things are things you can do even if you don't have a dedicated CTI team or background. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how you can better integrate threat intelligence into purple teaming across 4 different areas. Threats seems kind of obvious. TTPs, probably heard about TTPs. George kind of set me up well for that one. Tools, and then the last one, timing. Maybe this is one you haven't thought about, but as we go through this, we're going to be hitting on these themes of collaboration and thinking about how can threat intel add value. Start with threats. Before we get to talking about threats, I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about definitions. Now, pyramids, we all know, are fundamental for any cybersecurity presentation. And so as I was thinking about, right, all these different terms, how do we fit them together? I was like, okay, I think of these terms like a little pyramid. There's something you add as you go up. Other people might have different definitions of these terms. Awesome. So one thing as you hang out today, think about as we have presenters talking about adversary emulation or purple teaming or testing, how do they define these? Right at the bottom, I think of testing as any attempt to see if a security control or detection or response works, right? And this could be something like penetration testing, even scanning, any attempt to see if your security works. Moving up that pyramid, red teaming. Red teaming, adding in some kind of an adversarial role where someone says, we're intentionally gonna pretend to be an enemy. And red teaming isn't just something we do in terms of testing. It's also something, right, in intelligence. If there's an intelligence assessment and someone just intentionally says, I'm going to red team this, I'm going to pretend to be contrary to improve our assessment. So any kind of adversarial role is red teaming. But as George kind of hit on earlier, right, you can red team without thinking about the defense so much, right? You can red team and go in and test and pretend to be an adversary, and then you can just throw it over the fence and say, good luck, defenders. Ideally, you want to talk to each other though, right? That's why we're here today. That's a purple teaming piece. Adding in those blue teamers, those defenders who can say, cool, what did the red team do? What did we miss? Where can we improve? And then at the top of this pyramid, I think of this term adversary emulation, right? You can absolutely do purple teaming, red teaming, and just choose your techniques, choose your tools based on whatever you feel like using. But I think there's a lot of value in adversary emulation, which I define as adding in, right, an effort to act like a real and ideally relevant threat. And I should give a huge shout out to Bryson, who years ago, I think it was at, DerbyCon, kind of called on me and was like, Katie, what do you think of adversary emulation? And definitely colored my thinking about this. But right, making a dedicated effort to behave like a real threat, ideally one that's relevant to your organization. That's where I think threat intel can provide so much value. And as we go through the other sections, I think threat intel can help those other types. If you're just doing purple teaming without adversary emulation, totally fine. But of course, based on my background, I think there's so much value in choosing a real threat that's relevant to you to pretend to be like. So how do you do that, right? How can threat intel help with this adversary emulation or choosing a relevant threat? In addition to triangles, I'm also going to use a lot of circles in my presentation today. As we think about choosing relevant threats, I like to tie in this term threat modeling. Right? Threat modeling, there are a lot of complex methodologies, but at a simple level, I think of it as lining up us, our organization, our assets, our information with them, the adversaries and threats. And then at that overlap are the threats that we think are probably pretty interested in our organization, that are likely to target us. And that overlap is exactly where you can look for relevant threats to use during adversary emulation, if that works for you. Couple simple questions to think about. And again, even if you don't have a threat intel team, you as a tester, as a red teamer, can think about some of these questions. What are the threats that are likely to affect the organization I'm testing? Well, think about, okay, are there threats that have targeted your organization before, or maybe your industry? You haven't seen them yet, but you suspect, talking to your friends and collaborating, they might come after you. How about regional targeting? This is sometimes a thing, right? If you're in a particular area of the world, let's talk about Eastern Europe, right? If you're in Ukraine, maybe there are certain threats you're concerned about from the GRU, from teams like Sandworm or the Bears, right? So think about regional targeting. Or has it targeted your software technologies, right? If you're using Mac OS, you're going to care about maybe different threats than Windows enterprises. So a couple simple questions that, whether you're a threat intel team or not, you can think about. Here are maybe some good threats that you should consider choosing. Another consideration, this is something that, right, when I worked on the MITRE attack evaluations team, we thought about when you're trying to emulate an adversary, you got to know something about that adversary. So as you're thinking about what threat to choose, think about, is there enough intel, either open source or from your friends or from your own organization, that you can use to try to realistically emulate this adversary? Let's talk collaboration and, of course, compromise, right? As you do this, you're going to have to compromise. Sometimes you might think through threats and the threat intel folks are like, well, Nobelium, right? Russian threat, really concerned about them. We got to emulate Nobelium. They are a top threat right now. Maybe this is where talking to these other teams matters. Maybe your blue team comes in and says, yeah, that sounds cool, but right, Nobelium uses a lot of cloud techniques. We don't have cloud logs right now. So, all right, as threat intel analysts, you might have to compromise a little bit. That's part of this. Part of collaboration is compromise. So best practices for this, right? As you're choosing a threat, if you want to do adversary emulation, have a couple. Be flexible. Talk through, as we go through these other sections, talk through your options for emulating TTPs, tools, and timing, and then figure out, okay, out of a short list of threats, which is the one we really want to emulate? Try to add that value, that realism, to make sure we're testing against a threat we really care about. That's the first area. Seems kind of obvious, right? Threat intel can help make choices about what threats you emulate. Next up, let's talk about TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And certainly, if you've heard of MITRE ATT&CK, that's often how we talk about TTPs, those adversary behaviors. And as a community, we've come such a long way to try to think about TTPs we're using in purple teaming. Bryson kindly mentioned Red Canary's annual threat detection report came out a couple of weeks ago. And what we did is we looked at across all of our visibility, what are the top techniques that adversaries and testers combined all in one used over last year? You can see our top techniques here on the slide, and this is a great starting place. I would argue even the process of looking at our detections and deciding which techniques are top, that's really looking at real threats and prioritizing based on them. That's threat intel being injected. And so purple teams could take a look at this, say, hey, maybe we want to try to mimic some of these techniques. Shout out to George. I put a link at the bottom just last night, kind of a late breaking edition. He took these top techniques and said, cool, I can build on that. I'm going to collaborate. I'm going to take what someone else has done and create scripts to help test all of these top techniques, which is pretty awesome. This is a great starting point. Even knowing, hey, top technique, command and scripting interpreter, adversaries love them some PowerShell. If you're testing on PowerShell, pretty good chance you're going to be testing techniques that real adversaries are using. Technique's a great starting point, but time for another pyramid. And shout out to Chris Peacock on this one, the TTP pyramid. We so often talked about TTPs together, but really important to note that they're distinct things, right? I use the MITRE ATT&CK parlance for TTPs. There might be other definitions, but example, right? Tactics, the adversary's technical goal. Accessing credentials is a huge one. If adversaries get credentials, they can move laterally, they can do whatever they want, especially if they get admin. So that's the tactic level. All right, next level of detail, techniques. So for example, credential dumping from the operating system. Of course, MITRE ATT&CK added sub-techniques, I think it was over a year ago now, and a sub-technique, a specific way you can achieve credential dumping on the operating system is with LSAS memory, right? A lot of credentials stored in memory. Adversaries can pull those out. So that's the technique level, right? Credential dumping, maybe via LSAS. But then at the top, the procedure level. This is where I find a lot of people who start to use MITRE ATT&CK kind of stop at the technique level. And as I said, there's value emulating something like PowerShell, but you can get to that procedure level, as we'll talk about. That's really key. So for example, really common way that adversaries and especially testers love to dump credentials is via a living off the land binary called run DLL32, right? They use that to dump process memory using a function of another built-in tool, comm services, and then that function's mini dump. So dumping process memory with mini dump. That's the detailed implementation. That's the procedure level. Again, takeaway, we talk about TTPs, right? As one thing, they're really distinct things and really matters what you're testing on, what you're purple teaming on. And this is, again, where threat intel can have a lot of added value. Take a look at an example. If you haven't done this kind of work before, if you're newer to the space, don't get freaked out by this. Like, this is something I tell a lot of threat analysts. Maybe they come from a strategic background and they're like, oh my gosh, what is all this stuff? There are all these executables. I've never heard of commservices.dll. Don't sweat it. Everyone started somewhere. Everyone started by Googling a lot, right? So all that this is showing is, right, using this living off the land binary, run DLL32, it's built into Windows, to call a function called mini dump, right? It's just a part of that DLL file that's also built into Windows. And then it's just dumping process memory, right? That live capture of what's happening on a machine to retrieve credentials. That's all that's happening. This is a very, very common example of what my team sees when testers are going in and testing credential dumping. This is also something that adversaries will do, but we see this quite a bit. It's built into a lot of automated credential dumping testing tools. And so, cool, you come in, your testers try this out, and you feel pretty good. You say, awesome, right? We detected that. We found that that run DLL32 dumping process memory with mini dump, and you're like, great, we've tested a procedure. We are good to go for credential dumping. Then maybe you start looking a little further. Maybe your threat intel team comes in and says, oh, cool, that's awesome. You think you're done, great success. Yeah, that's awesome. You tested it, blue team found it, but let's take a look at the MITRE ATT&CK page, which is great for learning, for resources on what other threats have done for a technique. So you can see just in the description there, okay, we hit the one at the bottom, right? comservices.dll with the mini dump function, but proc dump, another common way adversaries will dump LSAS memory. Mimikatz, there are lots of variations using that tool. If you look at that page on the MITRE ATT&CK website, you're going to see there are 51 procedure examples from different groups and software. Some of those overlap, but you'll quickly realize that, all right, we've tested one procedure. We have more that we could do there, right? And you might be a little bit sad. You're like, cool, we caught that mini dump testing. That's awesome. Now we have all of these other procedures to test. Might make you a sad panda. If you take a look at the MITRE parent technique, right? LSAS memory is just one of 8 sub-techniques of OS credential dumping. That's when you start to realize, yeah, we're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need to do more testing, right? And so this is why it's so important to get to that procedure level. Even the sub-technique level is better than the technique level, right? Thinking about there's a lot more that adversaries can and have done in terms of credential dumping, other than that one specific procedure that we often see testers like to do over and over. Well, all right, let's give ourselves credit. Yeah, we tested one procedure under credential dumping, but right, this is where threat intel can help shape where do we go next? What do we do next for testing? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a really awesome open source project, right? Red Canary started this project, Atomic Red Team, but now it's really the community that runs it, right? It's a library of really simple tests meant to be accessible, right? They're atomic, they're in small parts. And so you can mix and match them. You can try out a bunch of different tests for the same technique. So for example, we were talking about OS credential dumping with LSAS memory. We tried one procedure. Atomic Red Team has 12 different tests for that. So that's a great place you can look to, right? As you talk to your threat intel team, you're like, hey, what should we focus on? Well, here are some options we can test on from Atomic Red Team, from other sources. So test and test again, right? That's the way you're going to start to build out and kind of build your confidence that, right, are we pretty likely we're going to catch credential dumping from all of these different procedures from adversaries? So OS credential dumping, really commonly used by a lot of adversaries and testers both. But what I've found as a threat intel person, right, as I'm looking through these different detections, I found that sometimes red teamers, purple teamers like to do things that maybe real adversaries don't do as much. And one of those that I often hone in on is another living off the land binary, VRKLCID. Kind of rolls off the tongue, right? VRKLCID. And this is a binary that is assigned, right? A signed binary, which kind of adds another level of legitimacy to an adversary. And adversaries can use this to proxy code execution. As we see on the MITRE ATT&CK website, right? Compared to 51 procedures for LSAS memory, there's one procedure example for VRKLCID. And that's very consistent with what I see, right? As I'm looking at these detections that come in, if I see VRKLCID in there, I'm sort of using my cognitive biases at play, but I'm kind of anchoring on the fact that, hey, this might be a tester. Again, it's not bad to test on VRKLCID, but if that's the only thing you're testing and you feel like, great, we've got signed binary proxy execution covered, right? Think about bringing in that threat intel, what real threats are doing to try to prioritize and make sure you're testing against things that actually happen in the wild. Again, we have to collaborate to improve here. So, right, maybe you have a conversation between blue and red and threat intel, and you realize, all right, we want to test cred dumping, and the red team says, cool, we know how to do that, right? We use our comm services, our mini dump, and hey, threat intel, this is where threat intel can add value and say, cool, maybe let's change it up. Here's something we've seen from a real adversary, a proper villain, to credit my teammate Tony, who uses that term, right? Bringing in some realism, what recent threats have done. So, right, thinking about what threats have done, also thinking about what threats don't often do, something like VirclSID, or another of the lull bins that I find is often used by testers is MS build, right? Real adversaries might use it, but if you're short on resources, and who isn't, prioritizing the things that a lot of threats do. And of course, keep testing, right? You try one procedure, you got to keep going, test and test again. Next area, moving on from TTP, is tooling. This is another hot topic, right? I break using a Venn diagram, big fan of circles and triangles. What options do testers have? Purple teams, red teams, as they're going in and trying out these TTPs, performing behaviors. Well, they can use things that they have, or they can attempt to get things that adversaries have, but in the middle is what I like to call dual use tools. These are things like Mimikatz or Cobalt Strike, Impacket, Bloodhound. You might have heard of some of these that, yes, testers use these and real adversaries use them. This can be a great option where, right, threat intel can say, here are some of these tools that are really popular that testers might be able to easily acquire. Also think about the fact that, right, there's going to be some custom malware, custom scripts, etc., that real adversaries are going to have that you're just not going to be able to acquire, right? Realistically, you can't get that source code. You can't recreate everything, but those dual use tools are often a happy medium to consider for tooling. How prevalent are they? Well, taking a look at the top 10 threats our teams observed last year, right? We define threats as malware or tools, software, etc. And as we look at this data, we combine both testing and real, quote, adversaries. And you'll see out of the top 10 threats we observed, half of them, 5, would fall into this dual use category, right? Suggesting that there are definitely both adversaries, proper villains, as well as red teamers and testers who use these tools. Awesome place to start, right? If you're trying to acquire tooling easily for testing. But as always, right, think about what happens when you don't necessarily collaborate. This is another example of something that when it pops up in a detection, kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. This is a tool called CrackMapExec, which is a slightly different implementation of Impacket. And it can do some various post-exploitation testing of Active Directory, can also do command redirection, right? As we see here. So redirecting those commands to a local host. This is something that when we see this, a lot of the time, it ends up being testing. Sure, real adversaries use CrackMapExec, but it's pretty noisy. It's fairly easy to detect. And so one thing that we often see is someone's going in and doing testing using CrackMapExec. It's really noisy and maybe they feel great about the testing results. And then you look at the details, you look at what was tested and realize, hey, that tool was pretty easy to detect. But if you try out the technique using a different approach, might not be as easy to detect. So again, thinking about how threat intel can help inspire the tools, whether it's a dual use tool or maybe just tools to maybe not rely solely on, like CrackMapExec. Again, as you collaborate, all about compromise, right? Maybe threat intel, you're like, there's this sweet custom malware this threat uses, and red team says, like, that's cool, but I can't mimic that exactly. Try out those dual use tools, absolutely, but don't just rely on them, right? We talked about living off the land binaries like run DLL32, comm services. Think about those because sometimes those tools are pretty easy for the blue team to detect, and you really want to make sure you're testing across the range of what adversaries do. Also varying those tool sets, right? You don't want to just use CrackMapExec over and over and over. They can detect that, right? Make it tough. That's where real improvement happens. Last but not least, I wanted to briefly touch on this concept of timing, which also relates to kind of this concept of noisiness. When I first started at Red Canary, I was going through training and there'd be detections that look something like this, right? You come in and there's ipconfig, netstat, who am I? These are common reconnaissance or discovery commands that adversaries and testers both use. But right, if you look at the timestamps here, this is inspired by real detections back to back to back, right? One command after another. And yeah, it keeps going. I'd see a lot of these commands and someone would say, oh, probably testing. And I'm like, wait, how did you know that? Over time, what I've noticed is that some testers don't think about their timing, right? They go in and sure, adversaries have used all of these discovery commands, but they don't think about the fact that, right, maybe in real life, adversaries don't do all of them at once. They're a little more strategic and thoughtful. So timing is another area where threat intel can provide a lot of value. A recent example from an amazing resource, the DEFR report, right? Maybe an adversary comes in and they do some initial discovery. They learn about the system they're on, right? The connections out, the domain trusts, just for their purposes then. And then a couple hours later, they come back and they have a different goal. And okay, there they want to figure out who has domain admin, who has enterprise admin. So this is a way you can think about, right, what real adversaries have done, inspiring the timing of purple teamers or testers. When you decide, does timing really matter, right? Think about your goals. I realize this is at the end, but it's sort of foundational to any kind of testing or purple teaming, right? Maybe your key goal is figuring out, do you have visibility into the data that would even let us see this thing? If that's your goal, cool, knock it out, right? Run all of your commands at once just to see if you see them. But if your goal is realistic detection, right? If an adversary did this exactly as performed with the timing, would we detect this? Well, realize that timing might change that. And as a defender, if I'm looking and I see a bunch of noisy commands, I'm going to say, yep, this is probably bad, versus if those are spread out over days or weeks, I might not catch that. So think about your goals and think about, does it make sense to mimic real adversary timing here? Again, all about collaborating, right? Maybe the threat intel tells you the adversary took months and months, low and slow compromise, but the red team has a week. Got to compromise, got to figure out, are there ways we could be a little more like real adversaries while still kind of compromising and meeting everyone's objectives? And of course, agreeing on your goals, kind of a key starting point for any of this. Wrapping things up here, right? Key takeaways I hope you'll go away with. Collaboration, a theme for the day. Collaboration is not always easy. Sometimes you're going to get frustrated, but right, as George said, empathy, thinking about what is the other person's approach? What is their background? What are they trying to achieve? Compromise is part of collaboration, but it's always worth it. And hopefully you've also seen how threat intelligence, right? Knowing what real adversaries do, actionable knowledge about that can help inform decisions for purple teaming across threats used, TTPs, tools, as well as timing. So in other words, you have to stop, collaborate, and listen. Did you really think I was going to make it through the talk without having a GIF of Vanilla Ice? With that, that's all I've got. So George, Chris, I think we have a couple minutes to just chat about things. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What do you disagree on?
That was awesome. What do I disagree on? I don't know. I mean, Mishta. Yeah, I mean, you did it. It's called Mishta. We
Excellent. I'm glad we can still be friends on that one.
But I don't know how I'm feeling about Verkelsid.
Verkelsid. It rolls right off the tongue.
Verkelsid.
Of course. Yeah, maybe not. Not so much.
I don't know. That's probably the only part I'm not disagreeing. I am going to sleep on it and see if it does really roll off the tongue. But
I'll take that.
But no, that was awesome. And yeah, I think we have Chris on. Chris, are you there?
Yeah, man, I'm here. Awesome talk, Katie. Yeah, it was great. One of the things that I would kind of dive into a little bit, we talked about like detections and stuff, but how important is analyzing the response to those detections? Because I've seen before where it's like Mimikatz on a domain controller and someone will be like, we removed Mimikatz and we're closing the case now, but we didn't actually go into why Mimikatz was on a DC. So how important is the response and how do we audit that?
Absolutely. We didn't even touch on that, but in talking about goals, I think starting with the knowledge of, are you testing response as well? Because as you noted, that's a little bit different. I've talked to red teams who are very, very stealthy. And I've heard of times where people have gotten, called back from their kids' soccer games to respond to an incident that turns out it was a red team. And so I think it all goes back to, what are your goals, right? Are you trying to test response, or are you just trying to test visibility or detection? I think those are different things, but yeah, response, such a key part of this. And I would argue that if you're trying to really make a difference in your org, you should be testing response as well, realizing though that's sometimes a little painful for the defenders who get called in the middle of the night, or maybe that's just not where your organization is, right? So again, compromising collaboration. Ideally, you test response to figure out, would we actually remediate? How would we clean this up to make sure they're not actually hanging around our network just because we removed the malware, right? So all going back to that compromise on your goals.
Yeah, and you actually just reminded me of one of the times that we were doing a stealth red team engagement, and we had to make the decision of, do we keep telling the team this because it's now Friday afternoon and they're going to keep working, 24/7 throughout the weekend, lots of people coming in that normally wouldn't, that if it was a real incident, of course you would. And, again, empathy, like, why would you do that? Or have you met your goals? And should you keep going or, not, right? It ties back. So that just reminded me of that. And Chris, we haven't even introduced you. You just jumped straight into questions. So this is Chris Peacock, everyone. If you do not know him, he is our detection engineer in the purple team we have built here at Scythe, because we're not all experts. So we hire people that are much smarter than us, and Chris definitely is in detection engineering. He's on Twitter, and one of the top contributors to Sigma, actually. I think you're top 10 now, which is pretty cool. And we have a few others that'll jump in throughout the day. So thanks for being here, Chris, and jumping on to Fireside Chat. I believe you do know Katie already. If not, well, now's a good time to say hi.
Everyone's friends on Twitter.
We are all friends on Twitter, but see, we are, because we all share this empathy thing. There's some people on Twitter that aren't very friendly, right?
The mute button is your friend.
The mute button is definitely. So that was awesome. Great first question to dive in there, Chris, on the detection engineering side, and of course leveraging CTI and procedure level CTI, right? And I think it all comes down to actionable cyber threat intelligence, right? I loved the quote. It was the first one I got. Pew pew maps are not cyber threat intel, right? So wanted to ask you, Katie, you've been doing cyber threat intel for a while. Where do you see this going, right? MITRE ATT&CK, obviously, now the common language and standard, little bit misused by some vendors, as we always see after the evals come out. Is procedure level the actionable area, or where do you see that going?
Yeah, I think procedure level definitely is the actionable area. And what I've seen over, since the attack was released, I think, was it 2015 it was publicly released? Someone will fact check me on that. I think that it's been sort of a gradual zoning in on the detail and how to kind of mature use of attack. I still definitely will see, but it's rarer and rarer, public reporting that just mentions attack techniques. It kind of hurts my heart a little bit. And I try to kind of respectfully push back or provide feedback, hey, knowing that an adversary used command and scripting interpreter, there are a lot of procedures and sub techniques under that. And so adding that procedure level detail, I think more and more people are realizing it. But I also acknowledge, it's easy for me to be yeah, add the procedure level detail because I have visibility into that. And I'm intimately familiar with attack. It's tough, right? Just keeping track of all the attack techniques and sub techniques is overwhelming. much less keeping track of all the procedures. And I do think that at some level, it's sort of a communication challenge of how do we communicate that in a clear way. I'm always a fan of like tables, spreadsheets, whatever you have that can communicate that procedure level detail. But collecting that, storing that, sharing that, it's not easy. And so I'm hoping the community will continue going to the procedure level of detail, but also recognizing it's hard. It's hard to do. And so, having empathy for people who aren't there yet.
We
Yeah,
all
100
just like stopped right when you said that. And Chris just wrote it here. It's the #1 most used tool across all of InfoSec is spreadsheets, right? Excel or Google or whatever you use. But
Love them.
yeah, definitely tracking it, right? And we all started there, right? And to this day, there's still stuff that we just, it's easier to put it on a spreadsheet than, figure out how to implement it onto some GRC tool that was built for open and closed vulnerabilities and not TTPs.
And one of the things too, you're talking about, y'all have such great collections at Red Canary at the procedure level, getting that host-based data. It's one of those things, knowing those procedures that ransomware actors do, does it enable you to catch them, at the beginning stages and kick them out of networks before they actually have that exfiltration and that impact?
Yeah, I swear I didn't ask you to ask me this. This is one of my favorite topics, thinking about ransomware and TTPs. Right? We didn't dive into too much this concept of stages, but I think that's a really key part to add on to TTPs in that discussion. And that could even be something where threat intel kind of can help purple teamers plan out their emulations, right? What are the stages we're going to accomplish? Because, right, that initial access so often happens via common malware, like iced ID, et cetera, moves on to kind of some of the discovery reconnaissance we talked about, often a dual use tool. Cobalt Strike is the most common one. But I think that's tying it back to purple teaming, especially if you're purple teaming a ransomware intrusion, right? You definitely want to think about dividing those TTPs into appropriate stages or kill chain phases for initial access, for reconnaissance, for lateral movement, for execution, and exfiltration before encryption. And I think that's key as you're thinking about testing ransomware, because as you know, Chris, right, if they can shut down the testers during initial access, if they catch iced ID before it moves to the recon and Cobalt Strike, that's awesome. And maybe that's kind of a good outcome for that test. Of course, if you're not testing response, like George kind of queued up, if you're just testing detection, you'd have sort of a different approach. But I think testing with that ransomware chain is always going to be a good way to kind of have your purple teaming inspired by real adversaries. Because ransomware, we talked about choosing relevant threats. Like, I know advanced persistent threats are cool and all, but ransomware, I would argue, is one of the threats that's likely to affect every single organization.
Yeah, it's like we always get asked, right? Because of course we build emulation plans
Yeah.
for all sorts of things, from very sophisticated threat actors to an attack chain like the one that that we built from the Red Canary report, right? Like those are great just getting started. You don't have to start with the most sophisticated adversary emulation when you haven't done any of this, right? Like start with these, because if you don't even have a CTI team, these are the top ones seen by a reputable company with a lot of good data. So start there. And obviously ransomware has no bounds and goes after every single industry. So definitely another place to start. And on the adversary emulation side, it's actually quite interesting, right? Because that is actually harder for a red team to do than just, their own TTPs. And I know we've talked about this a little, that some people just know how to do their attack chain, and that's what they just want to keep on doing. Push yourself, learn some of the other ones, obviously, when the organization is there and ready for that. So awesome stuff. I'm trying to see here if we have questions at the same time. Chris, you want to ask another one? That ransomware one was good.
Yeah, so and like this has been one of those tough things for people to actually figure out. So I'd love to get your take on this. How do you see that we can actually track CTI's impact on the emulations and also how that's impacting, development of detection opportunities and things like that. So we actually have these metrics to give back to our CISO or our CIO about how CTI is actually having that impact.
A metrics question, everyone's favorite topic. Yeah. Seriously, I love thinking about good metrics. Good metrics are so hard, but what I look for any CTI metrics is how can we track improved decisions? That's the goal of CTI or any intel. That's really, really hard. But when we're talking about purple teaming, one thing I'd look for is the outcomes of the testing, right? Afterwards, what improvements were the blue teamers, were the defenders able to make? Were they able to add some new analytics, some new security approach, maybe a control in response to what the purple team did that ideally was kind of had input from the intel team? And that chain is kind of tough to make, but as you use kind of techniques and procedures, you can start to kind of use that trace back, right? And this is something my team kind of looks at. One of our outputs is, right, how can we create new detection analytics that find threats that we don't detect today, right? And that's something that threat intel teams can and should be looking for. How can you drive better detections? So, right, I would kind of work backwards from, okay, what are the things that we've improved? And then figuring out, okay, was that something that the intel team gave input on? Because I think that thinking about meaningful metrics is always tough, but thinking about improved decisions, it's a much better metric than just counting things like, I don't know, number of procedures you threw at the wall or number of reports that you use for the emulation, right? It's really tough to get good qualitative metrics, but I think those are always more valuable, even if they're fewer than quantitative metrics.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And that was a big thing as well, from like moving from what we used to look at right back in the vulnerability side, that we would, see a vulnerability, use CVE, use CVSS, right? That was a metric. But those were things that were open or closed, right? You can mitigate that particular vulnerability by, I don't know, putting an ACL in place or something, and then the risk would go down, but it'd still be open. And now that we're looking at TTPs, it's kind of shifted that. So someone actually has this question, I don't know if we have time for it. It's like, how can we kind of integrate with most organizations that have vulnerability management, right? They know that vulnerability is there. They know the risk of it. They want to prioritize it. How do you bring in TTPs, which aren't open and closed, right? Like, you can run these things in your environment. You need to figure out detection. You need to figure out time. And I don't know if there is a good answer for that. I don't know if you've done any work. And of course, saying there is no answer yet is completely fine as well.
It's a really hard one. And I know we're running short on time, but briefly, I would say, I think you can combine TTPs plus exploitation of vulnerabilities. It's hard though, right? When there's some new vulnerability that comes out, the thing from a threat intel perspective, I'm always looking for is who's exploiting it and what TTPs happen after that exploitation, right? Because yes, patching is important, prevention is important, but you're not going to be able to always prevent everything. So looking at the full chain, what happens, right, before, during exploitation of vulnerability and after it really matters. So I think, right, vulnerabilities, TTPs can come together, but it's not an easy thing to do or to honestly emulate.
Yep. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you, Chris, that I totally messed up and threw you back as a attendee. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for that keynote. Really set the stage for the rest of the day. So we really appreciate that. Katie, as always, you are a rock star and we love you.